What up friends and soon to be friends. Today we're talking about the most important settings that make the Fuji X100V an absolute beast in street photography. And so for this video to make sense, you've really got to think of it in one way, that this is a tool to facilitate your street photography. And so when I'm talking about settings and buttons, I'm talking about how do you craft and adapt this into being a tool that then facilitates shooting your style of photography. So the X100V is a street photography thoroughbred. I don't know why anyone would choose to use this to shoot a full-length feature film as a wildlife photographer or a landscape photographer, so I'm going to assume that you also want to set this up for street photography. I want to make sure that I can adjust my settings fast. And for this to happen, I should know exactly which settings, which dials I am YOLO spinning to get to the settings that I think are going to be optimal. And I want to go from capturing highlights in a super contrasty environment to then spinning around, seeing a dude on a unicycle getting chased by a clown, and to also be able to capture that scene. And to do that, I've set my camera up to be super flexible, so I can go from really bright, harsh environments to really dark, shadowy environments, and to be able to slap the exposure around to capture what I want. And I like to have the ability to change all of those settings without taking my eye off the viewfinder, because I find that when I kind of do this, I then lose the composition that I was set on. And so I've now broken this down into the typical shutter speed, aperture and ISO ranges, the custom buttons I use for speed, quick menu settings, and anything miscellaneous. So let's get to it. It's probably safe to assume that in pretty much every time you take a photo, you are adjusting something in your camera. And as we are all part of the elite tier mirrorless gang, we are able to see the exposure directly through the viewfinder. And any DSLR purist that wants to laugh at you for not knowing your settings, you can just laugh at their overexposed, poorly composed images that they're trying to resuscitate on Lightroom. And so being mirrorless means that we have the ability to see our exposure live. And that is so sick. So let's start with the least important thing, the ISO. So I have my ISO set to 160, which is the lowest it can go, because I want to keep my ISO as low as possible and still get the correct exposure. Sometimes it goes up to like 320 or 400, but I don't really care. And now let's get on to the good stuff. This is all about speed. So I keep my shutter speed at about 500 to 1000. That means that pretty much every time I'm trying to capture an image of something, whether that's moving, whether it's still, it's pretty much always going to be sharp. And now here's where it gets fun. So I've adapted the spinny wheel on the back of the camera, and this little spinny wheel allows me to adjust the shutter speed within a range of around the 1/500 shutter speed. And as my thumb naturally sits on this wheel, it gives me an almost instant way to adjust the exposure whilst looking through the viewfinder. I know that if I spin it to the left, I can then brighten the exposure. If I spin it to the right, I can darken the exposure. And by having the main dial at either 500 or 1000, I can ferociously spin in either direction and adjust the exposure without worrying too much as to whether the image is still going to be sharp. And so what happens when that's not enough? And this brings us on to stage 2. Typically, I have my aperture set to 5.6. And why 5.6, you might be asking? Do I love the 5.6 depth of field? Is 5.6 my favorite denomination of 16.8? Does it look cool to say that I shoot at a high aperture? Well, yeah to all of those things, especially to look cool. But also, this gives me speed and flexibility. Let's say I'm out and about and I've had the best idea for an image and it is going to be a Pulitzer Prize winning shot. I'm there, my camera up to my face. I'm overexposed. I'm spinning my wheel at the back. It's still not enough. In the moment, I am seconds away from missing the shot. What do? There's only one option. Spinning the aperture wheel comes in absolutely clutch for helping you get the exposure that you want. And why 5.6, you might be asking? I find either having 5.6 or 8 is the ranges that give you the most flexibility. I am able to spin around and have several stops more of light. I'm also to spin it the other way and reduce the exposure by a couple of stops. And so by being set in the middle, it allows me to go one way or the other, giving me that flexibility to capture the shots that I want to capture. And as well as this, I kind of find that it's slightly more accurate, where every time I'm trying to adjust the shutter speed, I always spin it too many times, I miss the exposure, whereas with this, quickly stop on the exposure that you want. Shooting at a higher aperture also means that I then tend to focus more on composition, because instead of just shooting everything on f2, which looks cool, you're able to really start thinking about composition and make sure every element in the frame looks sick. And whilst your left hand is spinning around the aperture ring, your right thumb is naturally placed like here on these 3 dials. And this allows you to adjust the focus area kind of whilst you're all up in here. I'll be completely honest and say that I am so reliant on the autofocus features of this little camera because they are absolutely fantastic, which means that I rarely ever use manual focus. And so because I'm so reliant on the autofocus, I've then optimized the camera so that I give it the best chance of finding focus on the things that I want it to focus on. And sometimes, again, you'll be out shooting and you'll be composing a shot and you want to focus on something very specific, something quite like small and niche, right? And then you'll spin around and you'll see something completely different and you're like, oh fuck, I need to get my little focusing area thing from the right hand side all the way over to the left hand side, and it needs to be much wider because they're moving quickly towards me and I don't know what to do. And so what do? You watch videos like this to help you prepare beforehand. And so where do we begin? I recommend having your focus area set to all. I don't know why you'd have it specifically for like the small little zones or the super wide zones. And I would rather have the flexibility of going from a tiny single dot focus to a wide whole screen focus. And this can be easily changed through your quick menu or your main settings. So yeah, set it to all, give yourself the most flexibility. And so to access the different focus areas, the easiest way to do that is to click this button here and it brings it up. Or alternatively, I've got it set on this button up here. So when I'm taking a photo, I can just boop, and then with your thumb still on this wheel, you can then widen it, shrink it, spin it around. And by having your focus modes set to all, you can go from having a wide whole screen all the way down to a single point. You can go from having like 400 dots to choose from to 100 or something. Not really sure. And this can give you really tight control as to what your camera focuses on. And therefore this gives you the flexibility to capture all of the different shots you want to experiment with and to get. And another thing that I've got customized to my X100V, this little AEL and AFL button, if you press it, ta-da, brings up a spirit level. As my thumb is already in this kind of area, it means that when I'm up against the viewfinder, I can quickly press that button and then quickly see whether I'm level. And this is so dope because wonky photos that are meant to be straight really grinds my gear. Because either if you share them, send them to a client, it just doesn't look very professional. And then if you then straighten it out in Lightroom, the image then often is cut in, it's not quite composed in the way that you wanted it to be composed. And so by having really quick access to when you're looking through the viewfinder, to just press that little button, it then gives you a perfect display as to, is this straight? So I'm super reliant on having that setting as a spirit level because it saves my ass all the time. And so one of the other things that's really good with the Fuji's is the quick settings button. I use it more as like a customized my menu button as opposed to a way to quickly adjust my settings. And there are only a few things that I use in this, but I keep them pretty much the same every time I'm out shooting. I've got the ND filter, I've got the film simulation, I've got image size. And so when would I ever use these? So the ND filter is if I ever felt like I wanted to be a bit of an Instagram thought, taking some f2 photos in broad daylight, but I didn't want to have the shutter speed at 1/1 million. And so there's actually a pretty sick, pretty strong ND filter that you can just drop in, and it's a bit of a faff to get to in the main menu. So I have it set up, so I literally just boop, 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 boop. I also have film simulation set up because I like to use predominantly two. I like Classic Chrome and Acros, and if the light is really beautiful, really nice, I think the Classic Chrome is absolutely fantastic. But if I want to focus more on tonality and contrast and stuff like that, I then put it in Acros, and I want that to be as simple and as straightforward for me to access as possible. And the other thing that I'm able to change in the quick settings is the image size, and this is really, really underrated. Learning to compose in square or 16:9 is actually so fun, and it's another way to be creative and experiment with your camera. Maybe I'll make a video on this, I don't know, drop a comment if you think that would be something that's interesting. And finally, the last thing I can think of is a screen setting. I typically like having this display, because this gives me information about my shutter speed, where my focus area is, but predominantly I use it for the exposure settings on the side. And so with all of that being said, I hope that that was really useful. I use this camera in a very different way to most people. Most people are set on a single aperture or a single shutter speed and they adjust everything around it, whereas I care more about getting the exposure right as quickly as possible, and composition is key. And so I want to facilitate those two things. And so that's why I have my camera set up, so I can boop, 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 boop. If you found this interesting, please leave a like, a comment. If you're a soon-to-be friend, subscribe. If you have any questions about the Fuji X100V, either just anything about it or anything particular to do with my settings, let me know in the comments below, and I promise I will respond to you. And with all of this said and done, I hope that you have a fantastic day, whatever you're doing. And until next time, peace. Hello.
Hello. If I pay, can you go down and get lunch, please? I know early lunch, but it's good for money.
Look at this, I'm recording and
James, do not pretend.
I'm just an entrepreneur, so I'm going to take this deal.